I'm Kathleen Beal. I'm the chair of the Old House Group. And we have several officers here as well. Tom actually is former president and currently vice president. We have Steve Spiller, obviously, is a former president, former Heritage Awards chair, you were as well. And we have Thomas Jackson, who's our Old House, he's hospitality chairman for Old House and for the regular meetings. Marcus Paulson is our social media person, if you ever follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We have Marcus to thank. Judith Hunt is board member, former president, current Heritage Award chair for this year, and also the committee chair of the Downtown Business District Tours, of which we will be holding one this coming Saturday. What time, Judith?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock at Ed Hales Park.
Yeah. At the Sister City Clocks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Did I miss?
Greg.
Greg? There's Greg. And we have Greg Schrader, who is also a board member, but he is also a tour guide extraordinaire for the Downtown Business Tours. So anyway, if I missed anyone else, I apologize. So anyway, well, let's get started a little bit. We all know we're here to hear Steve, so I'm not gonna belabor too long, but I do want to tell you a little bit about the building that we're in. That's one of the reasons that we gather. Our Old House Group meetings are typically smaller, much more intimate in nature, and we go out and about around the city. And we are typically in historic structures. So why here? Why Prospect Park Carriage House? So for one thing, we have this historic setting, historic building. This is an 1896 structure, celebrated and received a Heritage Award, the 1998 Heritage Award, but celebrated its 100th in 1996. So this would be the setting that this structure would have been here when the Kimberleys were occupying Kimberly Crest, and so that's why we chose to be here. So let me tell you a little bit about what our Heritage Award says. Thomas Young England, resident of Philadelphia, began wintering in Redlands about 1887. Thomas was a partner in his family's leather industry in Philadelphia. On November 20th, 1887, he became a Redlands citizen and a California voter. England was enamored with Prospect Hill, which led to his purchase of the hill, April 4th, 1896, from George Meade of San Francisco. With the help of the Smiley brothers, England began landscaping the park. He built the carriage house, 1896, with a coachman's lodge addition to be used as an apartment while supervising the improvements of the park. This improvement included cut stone walls and curbs and drives constructed with many turns, allowing limited views of the plantings within the park. The turns provided the visitor with a surprise around each corner. This actually represents a split-level structure with a high gabled roof. Siding was made of redwood stained wood shingles, foundations made of rock. In the downstairs, there's actually exposed rock walls, and there's stables located downstairs. When England purchased the property, it was deeded to his wife, Emma Clarissa England, maiden name Coombs. They had been married in Philadelphia in 1862. Main entrance contains the two high gables. It's interesting to note that this restoration, because you're looking at it and thinking, well, this looks like a restored structure. As Steve pointed out when we were preparing for the talk, the citizens of Redlands saved Prospect Park from development with their fundraising efforts, but the same was true with the carriage house as well. The citizens of Redlands raised the money to restore this building. So, and that happened, as I said, in time for the 100th anniversary. There are gables in the daytime. If you ever come back up here, you'll see that the gables have a sawtooth frieze. There's a lot of really interesting wood detailing on the outside of the building. And so Citrograph newspaper, December 24th, 1898, noted that Mr. T.Y. England of Philadelphia accepted plans and specifications for an elegant residence to be erected on the most beautiful and commanding of all building sites, Prospect Hill in Redlands. That residence was never built. He died in 1906, January 2nd. The family owned the property until 1934, when Fred Hill purchased the property for $18,000 from the estate of Emma England. Sometime between 1918 and 1919, citrus trees were planted in Prospect Park. And a tax assessment shows in 1919 they were actually commercial groves. Friends of Prospect Park acquired the park from the Hill heirs in 1968, donating it to the city. The citrus acreage provides revenue for the city today. The Friends of Prospect Park kind of oversaw the efforts to restore this building. This is an interesting little note. There are, it said, note there are 2 decorative bird feeders high on the front of the buildings. That's obviously a daytime visit. And they said that it was a Pennsylvania custom before the turn of the century. And the feeders were always with the original structure. It's an interesting fact I did not know. So let's get to the reason we are here, and that is to have a conversation with Steve Spiller tonight. So before we start, we would like to ask, because we are recording the program tonight, we would like to ask if you can turn off your cell phones, and we will be doing a question and answer period at the end, so just be sure to hold on to your questions. Steve was born in Pomona, lived in Colorado and San Bernardino before the family moved to Redlands in 1964. A graduate of Redlands High, Steve was active in instrumental music throughout junior high, high school, and college. He received his BA degree in American History from Vermont's Castleton State College, which is now Vermont State at Castleton, and a master's in public history from UC Riverside. In graduate school, he completed an internship at the San Bernardino County Museum and produced a thesis, San Manuel Indian Reservation, an examination of its history. Steve's introduction to the museum profession was as an 18th century uniformed guide, interpreter, and drummer at the National Historic Landmark Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. He worked there 5 seasons during his graduate work at Castleton. From 1981 to 2002, Steve worked at Kimberly Crest House and Gardens. He resided in the house for nearly 3 years and was the home's first executive director. He retired January 2018 from the Mission Inn Foundation following a 15-and-a-half-year tenure where he was the museum and collections manager and later became the executive director. Steve's area of research include, but are not limited to, 20th century civil defense, historic preservation, the Pacific War, pioneer aviation, material culture, and California Native Americans. He was a founding board member of the Redlands Historical Museum Association, Redlands Conservancy, and Inland Harvest, past member of Redlands Kiwanis, and on the board of the statewide California Preservation Foundation. He was elected to Redlands Fortnightly in 2000, and has served as vice president and was appointed historian in 2023. He is married to Julie, who is a U of R graduate and retired speech pathologist. Current activities include as an associate member of the Joe Rosenthal chapter of the USMC Combat Correspondence Association. Chapter is working to have U.S. Navy ship named for Pulitzer Prize winning photographer Joe Rosenthal. Other interests and activities include serving on Riverside's National Historic Landmark Harada House Steering Committee, the Mission Inn Foundation's Collection Committee, and past president of Redlands Area Historical Society. So we'd like to bring Steve up. My co-presenter, tonight will be John Paul Veal, who's also a board member of the Historical Society. And we will start with some questions.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for coming, everyone, and thank you, Steve, for coming to share with us this evening what will be a fascinating talk. Without further ado, let's just start by sort of breaking the ice with the audience here. So how many of you out there in the audience have been inside this space before? Okay, a fair amount, good, just about everybody. How many of you been here, say, in the last 5 years? Okay, some hands. And how many of you have been to Kimberly Crest? I mean, this is probably a gimme. Are any of you? No?
I didn't see everybody.
Oh. Okay, we've assigned homework. Are any of you docents or in some way associated with the organization? Show of hands. Okay, yeah, look. All right, so we've already looked at the carriage house here, and there really are just only a few homes that are so synonymous with Redlands, and Kimberly Crest is one of them. So, you know, I guess maybe we'll just start with, what was the Kimberly family's relationship with Prospect Park? Would they've used it? Is it helpful to think of one in the context of the other?
Yeah, thank you, JP. It is, I mean, in terms of the context of Kimberly Crest, it's certainly part of Prospect Park. I mean, you can look at it as a whole. Certainly, legally, it was separate properties. Franz Hosp, who designed Prospect Park, the Smiley Park, Victoria Avenue and Riverside, also laid out the landscaping for Cornelia Hill, who was the first owner of Kimberly Crest. So I would think it's great to have it. Can you imagine the mobile home park in this, where we're sitting today, if Prospect Park had not been saved? And there were certainly people in Redlands, including, I remember one of my high school classmates' father was a big advocate for having this property developed.
And the plan was a mobile home park.
That's what I've heard. As well as where the Wissahickon is. I believe there's actually drawings for down by the Wissahickon. It was going to be a 2-story apartment house of some sort.
Well, so certainly, I guess, in terms of setting the stage here, you can sort of see the properties being a continuation of the other, the landscape architecture being sort of the unifying factor. And just a little bit about Franz Hosp. Where did he had some sort of an association with Central Park, right? That's where he learned his trade.
That's my understanding. I think he also did some, correct me, maybe Tom, I believe Franz Hosp also did some work on railroad stations as far as doing the landscaping for railroad stations. He ended up down in Carlsbad, incidentally, and was a big proponent of growing eucalyptus trees, which grow very fast, but they don't make very good train ties. But there is a grove down in Carlsbad named for Hosp as well. But Riverside is very proud of Hosp. He had a nursery over there. He was a remarkable person. I believe he's a German immigrant.
And just to add about Franz Hosp, that he also patented the Cecil Bruner rose that many of us who have historic homes have in our yard. And that's also a tie too, where you see the roses here in the park and also at Kimberly Crest. It is because he patented roses. He also developed the Carlsbad flower fields, for those of you who have been.
So Prospect Park was more of a botanical garden, and it still sort of is, right? But that was the view when the Kimberleys came in ownership of the Keys in 1905, right? When is it that the Kimberleys actually first came to town?
Looking back, I believe the earliest we could date would be 1899. I know they rented the Casa Loma Hotel, or rooms in the Casa Loma Hotel. They also, in 1905, had rented a cottage from Mrs. Bowers on Cedar Avenue, where Mrs. Shirk married Albert W. Shirk on March 5th of 1905.
And those are still standing today, right?
Exactly, yeah, those houses. Casa Loma, not.
Well, we can't win them all. So I mean, while we're on this topic, are there other structures here in town that have an association with Kimberleys? I mean, what was the family grouping like when they were here in town? Were they here all the time? Were there certain other houses here that they lived in or owned for a certain period of time?
Well, there are actually several houses in Redlands related to the Kimberly family. The house at the, let's see, northwest corner of Pacific and Highland, which is now or has been for years, the Beloit home. It was the Curtis family, and Mrs. Curtis, or the Curtis son, married one of the Kimberly daughters. And I think, just looking at it, the Curtis family, I don't know if they were the first ones here or not, but I did go through the city directories one time, looking for every name associated with the Kimberly family and when they show up in the city directories. But the problem with the city directories is that we're missing some. So you can't look year by year. But you've got the Curtis family there at Pacific and Highland. There's a house that burned, I think it's just a one-story. It would be 2 doors west of the Beloit house. That was a member of the Kimberly family, or the Curtis family, I believe. There's a house that's owned by J.E. Holmes and his wife on Highland. Tom, is that 240 Highland? The Hamilton house?
238 or something like that.
Some in there. It's a
Yeah.
J.E. Holmes and Mary Jo Holmes own that house now, but that was Mr. Kimberly's sister home, Mary Hamilton, and her daughter lived with her. Let's see. Oh, and there's that little house on Terracina called the Maury House.
So tell us about Clark Naval and Carol Longwood.
The house was owned by Willard Cheney, who was Mrs. Kimberly's sole brother. He lived there with his wife Nancy. He died relatively early. He was like the prodigal son. The story is that Mrs. Kimberly had two sisters, and they inherited their money when their father died in Indiana. Willard apparently got his money when he became of age. And the story is that after Willard died, or actually when Nancy Cheney died, that the sisters redistributed, no, let me jump back. When the father died, Mrs. Kimberly's father died, the money was redivided among the sisters, and they gave another portion to Willard. And so when Nancy Cheney died, there was a huge lawsuit, and there's all sorts of information on San Bernardino County regarding a lawsuit that said that Nancy Cheney could not give that money. She shouldn't have had access to that money to give it to charities that she wanted to give charity into. So whoever has the time, it would be an interesting search. And the reason that Carol Lombard and her mother come into play is that supposedly Carol Lombard's mother, of course Carol Lombard was Jane Peters by birth, is that her mother sued the estate of Nancy Cheney saying that that money shouldn't have gone to the Catholic Church, basically. And I just remember these great conversations with Frank Moore, who was the editor of the Press Enterprise, or excuse me, editor of the Facts, who said that his father knew all this information, but it never got printed in paper.
Gee, wonder why.
Anyway. So there's no ghost of Carol Lombard at the Maury House, as far as I know. But there are pictures of Carol Lombard at both the Maury House and at Kimberly Crest.
And it was possible at one point in time she was talked about as possibly inheriting the Kimberly Crest house once. No? No? Okay. It's a rumor that's floated around, so I thought I'd
never heard that they would inherit the Maury House either.
Okay. Well, you have a couple right.
Okay. Do you want to go to there?
Let's go.
Okay. So, who actually built the house? Can you tell us a little bit about Cornelia Hill as well?
Well, the builder or the person that had the house built was Cornelia Ann Hill, or Cornelia Ann Jordan Hill. And she was from Middletown, New York, which is Orange County, New York. One of my on my own dime type of trips was to Middletown. There is a French chateau, happens to be in Middletown. But the interesting thing about Middletown is not too far from New Paltz, New York, and it's not New Paltz, New York isn't far from Mohawk Mountain House that the Smileys built. So there could be a connection between the Smiley family coming to Redlands and Mrs. Hill coming to Redlands. And the house was built in 1897, excuse me. The architects were Oliver Perry Dennis and Lyman Farwell. I believe Dennis was from Seattle. And I can't remember about Lyman Farwell. But the interesting thing is Lyman Farwell's parents owned the house just north of the Maury House. And his father was an orange grower in Redlands. Well, that same house actually was later on occupied by members of Mrs. Kimberly's family. So there's another house that's related to that. The house was built by D.M. Donald, who obviously is very famous in Redlands. And we did an exhibit on the Donald family when I was at Kimberly Crest, and we got all sorts of blueprints and things. It was quite an experience to work with the Donald family still in Redlands on that.
And just to ask a couple clarifying questions, because I mean, I think a lot of people here in the room probably have heard the names, but just for the sake of you know, drilling down on that a little further, the Donald family, 3 successive generations of Redlands home builders,
It
and
was 5.
5. Okay, so for a very long period of time, could you talk a little bit further about them? Just maybe 30 seconds.
They were Scottish immigrants. There is one Donald, well, I'm aware of a Donald house up by the Country Club, which was a 50s house, but the one that we most recognize in Redlands is the corner of San Mateo and Brookside on Barton Road, which is what they call the wedding cake house, which I think a Dr. Watson has a medical practice in there. Wilson. Okay. But I do know that we were doing some work at Kimberly Crest, and we pulled out some newspapers, just shredded newspapers, looked like maybe a mouse's nest or something. And I created an environmental chamber, a water chamber, that will allow you to flatten the newspapers. And as I flattened the newspapers, they were from Scotland. So I think it's great that carpenters will leave remains or things to date. For instance, I made a mantle at home, and I left a penny and stuff, and I signed Julie and my name in it. Can't remember what else I put in. Oh, our wedding announcement, okay. There was a carpenter, two brothers and another one who worked for D.M. Donald for decades. And we were doing work down by the lily pond at Kimberly Crest. And as we pulled off the sideboards, kind of the shiplap there, we came across a piece of wood that had been signed and dated by the carpenters. I then was able to track down the widow of one of these people. His name was Emile Prey, and he lived over on college or campus. I went to visit Mrs. Prey. She pulled out a grocery sack, the real paper ones, and she pulled out all her husband's logbooks from all the time he worked at D.M. Donald, or Gordon Donald, and he told exactly how long he'd been working at Kimberly Crest for different projects. I hope that those logbooks are at the Heritage Room at Smiley Library, because I returned them to her and then I alerted the staff at the Heritage Room. So, and that would tell other things like when they restuccoed the house, when they put the elevator in, when they did some other additions to Kimberly Crest.
Fascinating. So here's a question, which I'm sure anyone connected with Kimberly Crest hears quite often. What's the relationship between Kimberly Crest, the Magic Castle, the LA Athletic Club, and the Pentagon?
Well, you're throwing in a curve to me. Repeat the last.
The connection between Kimberly Crest and the Magic Castle.
Okay.
We'll start there.
Okay. Well, that's Roland B. Lane was from a banker from Wisconsin, same as the Kimberleys, and I'm not sure how far away from Neenah, Wisconsin, where the Kimberleys lived, Lane came from. And Lane owned a home that's still in existence, I believe, up on Center Street. Well, Lane left Redlands and he moved to Hollywood, and he wanted to build a house there, and he built I believe he had Dennis and Farwell involved in the project. The tower on the house in Hollywood, which I believe is on Highland, is to the right, and then the smaller turrets on the left. It's really, really hard to kind of figure out this, whether it's a total mirror image or just a partial reversal. Because that's the Magic Castle, which is a private magician's club that's been there for years and years. It was started by the Larson brothers, who have since passed away.
Okay. The Athletic Club and the Pentagon are the same connection.
Okay. Mrs. One of the Kimberly daughters, Nancy, married a gentleman named Bergstrom, who was a graduate of the Sheffield School in Yale, and that's the same one that Mr. Brown, Judson and Brown, graduated from. And then this son-in-law, George Edward Bergstrom, went on to study at MIT. He came out to Los Angeles. He got a job working for John Parkinson, who was a well-known English architect in Los Angeles. Eventually, Bergstrom became a partner, so it was Parkinson and Bergstrom. And then Bergstrom left Parkinson, got involved in an architectural group called Allied Architects. And then Parkinson's son joined his father, and they did some buildings in LA, the Coliseum, City Hall, just a few major things. George Edwin Bergstrom designed the gardens at Kimberly Crest. He designed Redlands Junior High, Clock Auditorium. He was involved in a group called Allied Architects. They did the Pasadena Civic Auditorium. And I'm not not sure if the Pasadena Playhouse is in that group, but then I'm assuming that they did the athletic club. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And then George was president of the American Institute of Architects, and World War II came along. They needed a building in Washington for the Defense Department, and he was one of the 2 chief architects of the Pentagon. He also got involved in some controversy, and I think he was voted out as president of the American Institute of Architects. But he was from Neenah, Wisconsin. There's some beautiful, there was Bergstrom Paper Company in Neenah. There's the Bergstrom Mahler Museum in Neenah, which is a paperweight museum, basically. Right on the banks of Lake Winnebago. It's just gorgeous there. You can go down Wisconsin Avenue in Neenah, and on the left is the Kimberly family, the first house they built when they moved to Neenah from Troy, New York. The second house is John Alfred and Helen Cheney Kimberly's house, which is an Italianate house. And on the other side of the house, you've got, right in a row, Frank Shattuck, Havilia Babcock, and C.B. Clark, Charles Benjamin Clark's house. And those are the other 3 founders of Kimberly Clark. And that was in 1872. But anyway, that's Bergstrom. You know, as I was thinking about this, Andy, I don't know if you watched the junior high being torn down or not. Tom, certainly we saw it being torn down when we were in high school. The Clock Auditorium was built about the same time as the second wing of Redlands Junior High. But they chose to tear down Redlands Junior High. They chose to retrofit Clock Auditorium. And so when I was in high school, Clock Auditorium was open for maybe 6 months or something, and then closed the rest of the time I was in high school.
And so we'll just recapitulate a little bit because there's a lot there and it's wonderful. So George Edwin Bergstrom would be Mrs. Shirk's brother-in-law, and he did the terraced gardens at Kimberly Crest, Clock Auditorium, a lot of other notable buildings in
One more building. Does anybody remember the First National Bank at Orange and State? Well, it had some beautiful fluted columns and stuff. That was built in 1913, and Edwin Bergstrom was the architect.
That's wonderful. And you had a couple more, right?
Well, I think we're on to the next item about significant items of art in the house during the Kimberly and Shirk era. And if you could tell us about that, things that might have been American Impressionists and National Gallery, the Met, and the Oval Office.
And artists were attracted to Kimberly Crest. I'm going to start there. There's an artist, and I can't remember his name, who did a painting of Kimberly Crest that we were going, one of our board members, Jean Kramer, was going to purchase for us. And 30 minutes before she made the call, it got sold to a company, a corporate collection in Arizona. But I recently found out that another painting of Kimberly Crest is in the White House collection. And this artist did a lot of pictures of in San Francisco and things, and I'll try to remember between now and then. There's an artist named Guy Wiggins who did American Impressionism, and there's a painting still at Kimberly Crest, I assume, by Guy Wiggins, and a beautiful little Christmas card next to a reprint of a Guy Wiggins. Then there's an American Impressionist named Child Hassan, and JP he was famous for doing pictures of flags in New York City, and even Guy Wiggins did a lot of that too. But I was back in New Hampshire during my tenure at Kimberly Crest, and a friend of mine worked at one of the grand hotels in New Hampshire. We walked into the gift shop there, and there was a copy of Yankee magazine for sale. On the cover of that was the painting that had been at Kimberly Crest. Well, that painting ended up at the Payne Arts Center, which was Mrs. Shirt's sister's museum in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And that was sent to, I believe it was sent, I don't know if it was after Mrs. Payne died, which I think was, what, 1973, somewhere in there, or it was after Mrs. Shirt. But their museum, the Payne Arts Center in Arboretum, decided that that painting wasn't within their scope of the collection, and then they sold it. And so then that's when I think it appeared in that cover of Yankee magazine. There's a wonderful painting of beech trees by John Elwood Bundy in the collection of Kimberly Crest. John Elwood Bundy was from Indiana. He was a professor of art at Earlham College, Quaker College in Richmond. And they have a significant collection of Bundy paintings at the college and also at the art museum in Richmond, which is connected to the same structure of campus as their local high school. And the John Elwood Bundy painting hung over their fireplace, Mrs. Shirk's family's house that she and her husband had built in around 1912. And that had a prominent position in that house. And now it has a prominent place at Kimberly Crest. There's a Bertha Lum who did Japanese printmaking. Obviously you have Tiffany items in the collection, a lily lamp, a dogwood lamp, a floor lamp, and then a hanging lamp. The hanging lamp happened to be out just stored in the carriage house, and the bulb broke of the light that was hanging there. And so they just happened to have this extra lamp, which was a Tiffany, and replaced the other lamp, which I think had an alabaster bowl, and as far as I know, the alabaster lamp is still there. But the Tiffany lamp, so there's Tiffany, the fireplace, there's evidence that Tiffany a Tiffany representative did the decorating at Kimberly Crest. To my knowledge, there's no definitive evidence that Tiffany personally was involved in the decorating. The beautiful Art Nouveau, arts and crafts era too, fireplace tile is just gorgeous. I do have a little pet peeve with when Brent Waterman went in there and filmed at Kimberly Crest, and he's talking to Larry Burgess, and they're saying, well, isn't this fireplace such a great example of the arts and crafts movement? And that Mrs. Hill, who was the first owner of Kimberly Crest, took that inspiration from that fireplace and built an arts and crafts house on Palm Avenue, close to San Mateo. Well, if you look at historic photographs of when Mrs. Hill owned that house, that fireplace was not there. So the argument that Mrs. Hill put in that fireplace is false. That had to have been the Kimberlys.
You heard it here first, folks. And just, to sort of drill down on that, the Kimberlys did put their own architectural legacy into the house. The house as it was built by Mrs. Hill was to take inspiration from chateaus she'd seen in the Loire, like Chateau de Chenonceau and others, right?
Yeah, the Kimberlys, there are some wonderful photographs of Mrs. Hill's interiors. You may not know that at Mohawk Mountain House, the Smiley brothers held these Indian conferences. They were very involved in the peace movement, but also the treatment of Native Americans. And Albert Smiley was on the Mission Commission, which was 3 members who established the Mission Indian reservations in Southern California. And so they held these conferences with the who's who of American leadership attending the conferences at Mohawk. Well, as I said, Middletown isn't very far from Mohawk, and in some of the historic photographs of Kimberly Crest, you see these beautiful California native Indian basketry. Some of those baskets ended up at the Southwest Museum, which was in Highland Park. That has been taken over by the Autry Museum, which is at Griffith Park. And so they're in their collection now. And we were able to borrow one of the baskets from the Southwest Museum for an exhibit. And it was one exactly pictured in the photograph of Kimberly Crest, or Mrs. Hill's house. So, and in the collection, I'm getting diverging a little bit. One of the items in the collection that was acquired by Frank Moore, as I said, was the editor of the Facts, was a scrapbook belonging to Mrs. Hill. And one of those, the basket we borrowed was from the Hoopa Indians, which were way up north. But the scrapbook also reflects the Hoopa Indian Reservation. And Frank was able to acquire that scrapbook from the Hill family members who he had connected with earlier before I moved into Kimberly Crest. And so we tried to work with the curator of anthropology at the San Bernardino County Museum to see if we could find out more about whether Mrs. Hill actually spent time at the Hoopa Reservation. But we do know that she rented out Kimberly Crest to the sisters that owned Brent Waterman's house.
Stokes.
The Stokes house, yeah, Stokes. So the Stokes sisters lived at Kimberly Crest for a little while. I have no idea as far as documentation. But this, one of the research projects that's still hanging is this connection of Mrs. Hill with the Hoopa Indians and whether she was quite the advocate for them.
Yes, and I think we might jump ahead a little bit, or, well, okay, sure. Well, so we've asked about the inside of the house. I mean, there's so many dimensions and lenses to look at a property like Kimberly Crest through, right? I mean, there's the family, the architecture, the interiors. And we've already talked a little bit about the structural items of the gardens with George Bergstrom, but are there other, things in terms of the plantings, I mean, that are also important to the story of the house and the grounds to be understood in its context? Are there particularly notable plantings on the grounds, to your mind, that, similar to an important work of art that, are worth noting?
Well, and this combines with Prospect Park. One of the great things that I liked was looking at the deodar cedars with this huge, or this kind of willow pink top. It's just, and there's a certain time of the year where the turkey vultures would come in and roost in those deodars. And I don't know if they still do or not. But you could set your calendar by those turkey vultures coming in. They'd go out in the desert to feed, and then they'd come back in the evening. The same way with the crows. But the deodar firs were just phenomenal. And you've got them in Prospect Park. I don't know the condition of them now. There was a wonderful tree, by the way, just near here in Prospect Park. It was one of the great big cones. And it was decided that it was a liability for those cones, so they cut the tree down. There's a Montezuma cypress, which I think is really beautiful at Kimberly Crest. There's the magnolia. I love the crepe myrtle and just the colors that came off the crepe myrtle that's on the west side of the house. And of course the sago palm, which we had to trim a little bit to keep away from, so it didn't impede on people walking on that sidewalk. And now you've heard the story that Disneyland wanted to buy it. I don't, Marcus might know. But anyway, I had not heard that, but certainly the deodars and the height and the palms. I mean, there are days where you see that thing just, they would, in the wind, would just go back and forth. And I guess she took one out sometime in the last couple of years or so. Because I saw it on YouTube with a tree trimmer out there taking it. And of course, there's a wonderful camphor tree. I know there's a maple, a Japanese maple tree. And of course, the magnolia tree was our Christmas tree starting, I think, in 1986, which was actually a restoration of what had been done in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Mrs. Shirks, one of her gardeners, Joe Munoz, decided as a gift to light the magnolia tree. And he would climb up, he created his own rigging and would climb up the tree, and he made his own strings of lights. It was a little scary because he would string the lights, the power cord, into Mrs. Payne's bedroom on the west side of the house and just plug it in. And then he made just a wooden star and attached lights to that for the top. And then, and if you have a copy of the Prospect Park book, published in 1968, you can see Dr. Dabrowski in his opening remarks talk about that Christmas tree as a gift to the community. The tree got damaged severely in November of 1982 by a rainstorm, windstorm, and so it wasn't full, and but it started to grow back, and one of our board members, Ann Bethel, who was the curator of history at the San Bernardino County Museum, suggested we try to resurrect that. Well, how do you start? Well, I checked with the National Park Service. I got a hold of the lighting designer for the Christmas tree at the White House. He worked for GE, and he told me the key to doing that was use different wattage bulbs for the different colors. So blue was 40, red was, and green was 25, and yellow was 15. And that creates an equal color balance. Because if you look at Christmas lights, they're dominated by red, if you squint. So we made our own strings of lights. TBM Electric came in and put in a special sub panel for it. We had to hire a tree trimmer with a crane to put the lights up. We simply attached 2 or 3 wires to a drill with a nail on it, and we just stretched out the wire, and by using the drill, it twisted the wire, and then we just added the outlet, or the sockets every so many feet. And one of the gentlemen that worked on this project was a man named Russ Dornbush, who was late 70s, early 80s, who took the project on of restoring the railing around the Kimberly Crest. But he also helped, he made the star, and anyway, it was a great experience. And if it hadn't been for that lighting designer at GE, we would have never known the kind of behind-the-scenes secrets.
It's really fascinating.
So let's move ahead a little bit. And Steve, could you tell us a little bit about how you came to be connected with Kimberly Crest, and how soon after the death of Mrs. Shirk was that?
In graduate school at UC Riverside, I was selling women's shoes at Harris's. We had a crew of like 10 people. It was amazing. I mean, we did it the old-fashioned way. Stools and suits and sport coats and ties. But I then graduated from UC Riverside with my master's degree. As Kathy mentioned, my research for my master's field report was the history of San Manuel prior to any gambling. They led an extraordinary, difficult life. They didn't have running water up there till 1969. But anyway, The other project I was working on in grad school was cataloging a phenomenal collection of glass negatives at the San Bernardino County Museum by Elias Foster Everett, who was a wonderful pioneer photographer in Redlands, who had come from Mankato, Minnesota, via Grants Pass, Oregon, and then to Redlands. And any of the pictures you see at presidential visits in Redlands, that was Elias's work or assistant photographers. But anyway, I was selling shoes. I had a job for the city of Bellflower, writing their 25th anniversary of incorporation book. Larry Burgess knew of me. Mrs. Shirk died on October 15th, 1979. They were looking for a house sitter. I think it took about a year for the estate to settle. Interestingly enough, a former board member, Judge Rex Cranmer, was the judge doing the probate. So he had to recuse himself from the board, but his wife was still on the board. But anyway, the foundation or the association acquired the property in February of 1981. And so it was maybe in the spring, Larry wrote a letter to the board, and he was now a member of the board, and suggested me as a house sitter. I was living in a 700 square foot, one-bedroom apartment in Riverside. And so I moved in on my 30th birthday, 1981. And the thing that greeted me was the ginger cookies smell. And I tell you, I don't want to blow my own horn, but I probably can make ginger cookies more in the style of Ann Canroy, who's the cook, than anybody else. Sorry, Nancy. But anyway, I moved in 1981, still worked at Harris's for a little while, and then came back to the board in early January, February, or something like that, and said I would work part-time. But I did help with the early docent training. I was doing things when I was working here. Literally, I could not leave the property unless somebody else was here or was there. So grocery shopping was done during the day. I hired my own house sitters, paid them out of my own pocket to be there when I couldn't be there. And I was, at that time, active in the Gordon pipe band, which later became the R.P. Blandford and Son pipe band, and playing drums. So during rehearsals, I had to get somebody else there, and I hired my father, hired other people. Then finally, the Kimberly Shirk Association started paying for house sitters. But initially, I was having to do that on my own. So I asked them to work part-time. They came back and said, would you work full-time? So I quit the project in Bellflower, and I didn't like the drive anyway, and became the resident manager, which then became the curator, which then became the executive director. The job description didn't change a whole lot. Oh, I moved out in May of 1983. I lived in Mr. Kimberly's room, but I value the opportunity to have lived in that house, to know how light changes, to see the lights coming down Cajon Pass at night. I would sit in the lazy boy chair in the main hall sitting room upstairs and watch the RCA TV there, eat my popcorn there and stuff. Is the TV and the lazy boy still in that room, or it's in one of the bedrooms?
It's one of the bedrooms.
Well, the main hall sitting room,
Yeah.
this is one of my pet peeves, was their living room.
Right.
That's where Mrs. Shirk took her meals. That's where she watched the Dodger baseball game. That's where she watched her favorite game shows. That's where she did her correspondence. So they did not have TVs in the bedrooms. One TV was in the main hall.
So I think you have some other memories of, significant events in the house. I mean, I think you mentioned watching certain world events unfold on that TV.
Well, yeah, we had, we watched the Challenger incident on that. We watched 9/11 on that. And there used to be a TV antenna on the roof. And I always wanted to bring that back, but there was also, during Mrs. Hill's time, there was a phenomenal American flagpole. And you see the early pictures of Kimberly Crest when Mrs. Hill owned it, and you see this really tall flagpole. Now, I've been from the crawl space in the basement to the roof. It's kind of dirty, the crawl space, but there, if you look into the attic of Kimberly Crest, which has a water tank for the gravity water flow, but there's also a spot where you can see a square in the attic, and that was for the flagpole to secure to come down. That's the two items on the TV that I can remember. I did take a photograph with a zoom lens of Stevie Nicks smoking a joint in the building.
So you were there for some of the movies too?
Not any movies, no.
Okay, but movies being filmed?
I was there for Fleetwood Mac. 1984, somewhere. The crew arrived at 8 in the morning. They left at 5 the next morning. And the band was playing up in the gardens at midnight. And I was just, what are people thinking? But we kept it very secret. I found out that I guess I went down to a Slider's music store and bought a tambourine. I had forgotten that little bit of information. But I did get them, I got a signed autographed album. Protected at home. So. We did other filming, an introduction to a movie or a interpretation movie for the Automobile Museum in Reno, which was great when all these old cars came up. We turned down a lot. We learned from Hell Night, which had been filmed the previous summer when the Kimberly Crest was still going through probate. So don't blame the Kimberly Shirk Association for Hell Night. It was the estate, it was the executors of Mrs. Shirk that allowed that. And if you go on the Kimberly Crest, the tower outside the dining hall, or dining room, you'll see little brown pieces, or little things attached to the stucco. That's stuff that was sprayed to look like cobwebs, and that still's there, what, 40 years, 30 years later.
So tell us a little bit about the movement to preserve Kimberly Crest. What was that like? And what was the public conversation like about preserving the house at that time? What was said for it? What was said against it? And how did we arrive at an independent foundation owning it? Why wasn't it a city park?
Going back through my notes, I think Mrs. Shirk said maybe it was in the Articles of Incorporation, the bylaws. It said they didn't want, it basically passed off the city as owning it. And I think it would be, if you look at city properties, I mean, you're at the will of the taxes and the other projects that take priorities. And I think perhaps they wanted to concentrate on making sure they had the independence to operate the historic house.
And the word was created not to board was created before her death.
Yeah, the board, okay, the city received Prospect Park in 1968. Mrs. Shirt gave the challenge. She said, I'll give my home to the people of Redlands if the money could be raised for a matching HUD grant. And as I recall, it was the longest escrow in Bank of America history. From when they started fundraising, and the money just didn't come in. And so they got this HUD grant, and but they had to match it, and Mrs. Shirt provided the incentive for people to give more money. And I remember buying the Prospect Park book as a gift for my parents for $10 or something down at Citrograph, but not knowing I'd ever be up here. But that was really the incentive. The Kimberly Shirk Association was established in 1969, in July, August, somewhere in there. The attorney was a John Sir. Mrs. Shirk was on the board. People that she really knew, maybe from the Congregational Church, other people that she worked with. Dr. Dombrowski, who was this wonderful orthopedic surgeon here in town, was on the board. Julian H. Blakely, very involved in the Scouts. Jordan Ingberg, who was the treasurer, was from the Congregational Church. But it was a small group. There was Marie Miller, I think Mrs. Shirk's family members, the ambassador, Francis Willis, who was the ambassador that lived in Redlands on Highland Avenue, was a member of the founding board. But you get up to, see, Mrs. Shirk died in October of '81. A couple of years before that, Frank Moore was also on the board, went to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C., wanted to get advice about how to operate a historic house museum. They told him, don't take the house without an endowment. The Kimberly Shirk Association had about $90,000 in their bank account. Julian Blakely had sat down with Mrs. Shirk and found out it cost about $45,000 a year to keep the house up. And that doesn't include the deferred maintenance, and there certainly was a lot of deferred maintenance. And so they approached Mrs. Shirk's executors with three nephews. One was Caleb Curtis, who was a member of the family that lived on Highland Avenue where the Delotes lived. I think Caleb's brother and then another nephew. And that other nephew was Kimberly Stewart. And they approached Caleb and said, we're going to need some money. And Caleb said, the time isn't right. Well, Mrs. Shirk was probably 96, 97 at the time. They returned to, my understanding is they returned to Caleb and said, let's get some money. And so Caleb said, well, they worked it out. I believe it was 1/5 of her estate or $1 million, whichever was the least amount. So it turned out to be $1 million gift. And that gift was received in 2 payments over about a 6-month period. We invested it in treasury notes at like 14%, which I don't even know what it is today, a treasury note.
No, 5, 6, 7.
Okay.
It's higher, it's been in years.
And then we had a professional company come in and manage the endowment. But certainly $1 million doesn't go very far. There were people who said, well, why don't you just spend the money? And you can't do that. And so the board set a limit as far as the interest and how much they would spend annually. One of the real challenges, though, in taking over the house was myself and others felt that we should be on the National Register of Historic Places. We should apply as a California state landmark. I presented a report to the executive committee, and at the time, I have to laugh, Dr. Fritz Bromberger, who was an English professor at the university, was on the executive committee. And Fritz, anyway, took the report, I had sent it out before the board, the executive committee meeting, to propose that we do the National Register. Well, Fritz's paper came back as if I was one of his English students. And I wish I'd kept that copy, because I've done a lot of writing since then. But Frank Moore was opposed to us applying to the National Register because he felt that somebody would tell us what to do. And so it sat in the to-do file for several years until we got Dr. Lauren Bricker, who was an architectural historian who just retired from Cal Poly Pomona, to write the nomination papers. If you look at the nomination papers for the National Register for the post office, it's 2 or 3 pages at the most. I think Lauren's is over 100.
She's on our commission now, isn't she? The Historic and Scenic Preservation Commission.
Oh, yeah, she's on the Redlands Historic Scenic Preservation Commission. She's also former chairman of the California Historic Resources Commission. So she knows what to do. And since she retired, maybe she'll have more time to do some things. But phenomenal architectural historian. Anyway, she wrote the nomination papers. Obviously, we were feeding her all sorts of information. She just put it in the right language. And then I did the California State Historic Landmark application. And so Lauren and I flew up to in Sacramento and presented our argument to the State Historic Resources Commission, which has to approve the application before it is sent on to the Interior Department in Washington, D.C. By the way, the State Historic Landmark is on the property down by the parking lot, and that plaque was paid for by the Redlands Area Historical Society.
So, at the time that you became affiliated with the house, did all of Mrs. Shirk's belongings remain at the house, and were certain items repatriated?
One of the challenges with Kimberly Crest, or with the Kimberly Shirk Association, was that no one really sat down with the family before they went through the belongings to determine what should be kept and what should be thrown away. Obviously, they kept things. For instance, there was a Tiffany, you've seen those Tiffany desk sets with the sides that hold the blotter and the inkwell and all of that sort of thing. Those were in, there was a Tiffany desk set on the desk closest to Mr. and Mrs. Kimberly's bedroom. That disappeared. If you went upstairs in what I would call the billiard room, there was a closet there, and it had these folder boxes, the old style folder boxes. Those had been full of correspondence. They all went into the trash, except a few that got overlooked, and we saved those. There were some photographs, I think, which were intended to be thrown out, and they got saved. For instance, photographs of Mr. and Mrs. Shirk's home in Peru, Indiana, which is a wonderful house. I've been there twice now. Designed by a contemporary of a Chicago architect who was a contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright. But anyway, they tossed that out. Mr. Shirk, and I've written a paper for fortnightly on Mr. Shirk. There's a book out by a Belgian author about Mr. Shirk as well, that includes Mr. Shirk and his when he enlisted in the Navy as an officer in World War I. And Mr. Shirk's full uniform had been here. Lieutenant JG. And all we had was the jobbers that were left, the leggings, leather leggings. I think a pelt from Mr. and Mrs. Shirk's dog was there. Because she moved here in 1920 after Albert died in September of 1919. And so I think anyway, these items got tossed out. And that's certainly a shame, especially from a historical standpoint. This correspondence, which could have just been bills and all that sort of stuff. For about a year, because we took over Mrs. Shirk's P.O. box, we got all her junk mail after she died. Now, I don't know what happened to all the junk mail between October of '79 and February of 1981, but when I came on board, I saved all the junk mail, hoping that I could then research who she supported and who she didn't as far as nonprofits. But anyway, that was an interesting project. I don't know if I would have ever gotten to it or not. Mrs. Shirk had diaries. The instructions we understood were they would be just thrown away. However, I will tell you that some of them do exist. We had one that was given to us, I think it's 1969. Or some of the diaries were actually 4 years in one book. But what was really valuable to me, was Mr. Shirk's day books, which the family did give us. And that was kind of a recreative thing, which goes into his daily activities, which, the man's in his late 60s. The family genetically is very hard of hearing. Mr. Kimberly was very hard of hearing. Mrs. Shirk was very hard of hearing, as well as other members of the family. Caleb Curtis was hard of hearing. So it was difficult to communicate with them. But Mr. Kimberly would talk about going up to Rose Hill, which is the home of the builder of Roland B. Lane, and doing the irrigating. So there's some connection between Roland B. Lane, not just borrowing the plans of Kimberly Crest to build his house in Hollywood. I don't know what that is, but we can find out. There was a table that we acquired that had been given to, I believe, Redlands, if I get it right. People in the community were asked to, I think, decorate or provide furnishings for Redlands Community Hospital. Yes, that's it. And Mrs. Shirk donated a table which has this beautiful griffins, the lion legs. Well, the director of Redlands Community Hospital was a guy named Mr. Jury. And he was very active in the Scottish Rite. And the Scottish Rite has a temple up on the 215 up by Cal State San Bernardino. And so after Mr. Jury left Redlands Community Hospital, some of those items that were at the hospital were taken up to the Scottish Rite. And the Scottish Rite does speech therapy for, I guess, people that can't afford it. And I think it was one of the speech therapists that told us this table was up there. So we were able to acquire that table. So that table was not at Kimberly Crest for at least my first 10 years there. So, and I don't know where that table had been at Kimberly Crest. The table we had in the center table was a folding table. But that, anyway, how these things happen.
Well, and I guess down to, in thinking about this as a Kimberly family museum, it's multiple generations of the Kimberly family that have an association with this house and grounds. And we mentioned their homes back in Wisconsin and in Indiana. is there a Kimberly Family Museum of any kind in their home state of Wisconsin or Indiana, or is this basically it?
As far as I know, this is basically it. The Neenah Historical Society in Wisconsin will occasionally do Kimberly related exhibits or paper industry exhibits. The house in the home in Peru, Indiana that Mr. and Mrs. Kimberly had built in 1911 was on a plot of land with with their house, Mr. Shirk's parents' house, and Mr. Shirk's brother's house. And the Shirk family were one of the wealthiest families in Indiana. So money married money. Okay. But one of the houses in Peru, Indiana, was a bed and breakfast for a while, and Julie and I saw it in 2022, and it looked not in real great shape. Neither did the Shirk house, which they turned around and sold in 1950. So they only had it for about 4 years. I saw the house in 1984. It was for sale, I think, at that time. It had just been purchased when Julie and I were there in the fall of 2022. And we did get to go inside. It was a brand new owner. And he had just been dealing with leaks in the basement the day before or something. And they were just living out of boxes. They hadn't actually fully moved in. And it needed a lot of work, unfortunately. And for some reason, not him, the new owner, but somebody else painted it in a Pepto-Bismol pink. It's a stucco house. I mean, it's gorgeous. It would have been great. When I saw it the first time, it was kind of a tan stucco. Mr. and Mrs. Shirk lived in Richmond, Indiana. And after that, they lived in an apartment, and I've been to the apartment, and I haven't been inside, got into the doorway, and that was it. And it's Richmond, industrial town, really needs some influence of some money and Main Street projects and that type of thing. But I know of no Kimberly. I mean, certainly they're honored, but they're only one of 4 people, and there are other paper companies in Neenah. And if you ever look at a manhole or a grate around a tree anywhere in the United States, look for Neenah Foundry. And that is one of the big industries remains today in Neenah. Well, I've seen it in Maine, all over the place. I look for them now.
Well, and I mean, to that end, your association with the Kimberly family history only really began when you started as a caretaker of Kimberly Crest. You've continued in communication and correspondence with various strains of the family down to the present, and you arrange vacations and travel around it, right? I mean, talk to us about the trip you arranged to Neenah for Redlands.
Oh yeah, and it was in 1997. We decided to do a trip called Following in the Footsteps of the Kimberleys. And Tom Sutter, who is a family member and a genealogist for the family, an extraordinary individual who just retired, gave up his law practice. But the Sutter family lived in Redlands for several years, moved back, I think, to Wisconsin in 1966. They lived up on Crown, they lived on Highland Avenue, 7 children. But Tom is the historian of the family, and he went to Cope Junior High, but I don't think he finished all 3 years. But anyway, he was one of my first connections with the Kimberly family. He came out with this wonderful genealogy of the family in 1984, which was the second edition. There was one hired by the Kimberly family in 1950 or 51, a professional genealogy that was really valuable. But anyway, I started communicating with Tom. There was also a young man from Redlands who was the youngest docent in the history of Kimberly Crest, named John Eastberg. I think he was docent when he was in junior high. And John had strong Wisconsin roots, and he ended up being the director of the Pabst Mansion in Milwaukee. But at the time, he had another job with the Pabst Mansion. So he was our host in Milwaukee. And I think we took about 20 people at the most, some of them board members. And we went there for a week. And at the time, Kimberly Clark had an airline called Midwest Express. And it flew direct from Los Angeles to Milwaukee. And so we went on Midwest Express. They were known for filet mignon on board, real china, fresh baked chocolate chip cookies. So it was worth it. We flew from Los Angeles to Milwaukee. We got tours of Milwaukee. John hosted us at the Wisconsin Club in Milwaukee for a dinner, which was wonderful. Then we went toward Madison, and there's a place called Old World, Wisconsin, which is a historic village of various historic structures that have been brought in. We then went up to Neenah, and actually Neenah has a sister city called Menasha, Neenah, Menasha. Tom did a great presentation on the Kimberly family. We got a tour of the Havilah Babcock House, which was one of Mr. Kimberly's partners. Havilah was in business with Mr. Kimberly in a dry goods business. The Kimberly family home we couldn't get into, and I had tried to get into there in the early 80s, and the family wouldn't let me in. And even though I had made advanced reservations or advanced connections with them. We went to the Bergstrom Mahler Museum, which I said is this very well-known glass museum. We got a tour of a Kimberly Clark plant. We all came back with sweatshirts, which I still have. And I've also, with Frank Moore, we toured the Kimberly Clark plant in Fullerton. But that was great. We went to the cemetery where the family mausoleum is. And after that, we went up to Door County, which is really the Cape Cod of Wisconsin. Beautiful. Julie and I were there 2 years ago. It's right up above Green Bay, wonderful cherries and stuff. We did a fish fry, which Julie and I didn't get to go to because the Paper Hall of Fame was having their induction ceremony in Appleton, Wisconsin, and Mr. Kimberly was one of the inductees. And so Tom Sutter represented his great-great-great-grandfather or whatever, and we had beautiful filet, I remember. And then we came back to Milwaukee. One of the interesting things about Neenah, Wisconsin is when I met Julie through Kimberly Crest, which is another story. Turns out her stepfather was born and raised in Neenah. Her step-grandfather worked for Kimberly Clark. His name was Havilah. And so on our bus tour of Neenah, we stopped at these other houses, and people were wondering why we were stopping at those houses. Well, they were the houses of her stepfather. And then her stepfather's cousin came to our event too, to learn the history of, at the hotel.
Oh, that guy.
That cousin. Yeah. Cousin, our father's cousin. Anyway, so that's what we did. We wish we'd had more people in the tour. It was arranged by Laura Creature. worked out well.
Well, and wrapping up, 'cause I'm sure the audience has some questions too, we'll do some concluding matter. Would you like to take them?
So we have a question for you. If you were to look back at your career and time spent at Kimberly Crest, what do you consider to be your greatest accomplishments? And are there things that were left undone that you wish you had gotten accomplished?
I think certainly one of the accomplishments is the National Register. It's somewhat difficult to get. And JP's been working on a nomination for another site. So I know you know the intricacies of that. Just getting Kimberly Crest known. I mean, we were dealing with all the things. Do you allow women to wear high heels? No. Smoking was allowed. Those first. One of our board members would smoke in the kitchen.
I think I know who.
Getting a conditional use permit with the city of Redlands. Parking, docent training. You know, I credit Tom Ashley, Larry Burgess, Frank Moore, Benjamin Robbie, all put together materials. Frank and Larry went back east. They went to Middletown before I did, so they knew about Mrs. Hill. So you had to assemble all that stuff. I think one of the mistakes that was made early on with the foundation, or the association, was that you had all these committees. People wanted to see Kimberly Crest. They figured that they got the house in February, they were going to open right away. There's work to be done. But we had board members, enthusiastic board members, who went in and decided to redecorate and rearrange the furniture. The powder room, the vanity got redone. Anita knows about this. The kitchen was a 1940s style kitchen, and it got remodeled. The powder room got remodeled. I would have liked to have seen those restored. We had the opportunity to restore the grandmother's rose garden. It was not part of Bergstrom's design. It was part of a design by a very well-known Los Angeles area architect named Edward Huntsman Trout, who did landscaping at Scripps College. Well, somehow Mrs. Scherp being on the board of Scripps College and being the president of Scripps College during part of World War II, she obviously knew Trout. He designed the rose garden. We had the plans for I think I got them at UCLA archives, had the plans that listed every old rose there. We could have only, one of those roses was not available. And I had a childhood friend who had an avocation of growing old roses, and we could have put those old roses in, which would have attracted more people who were interested in old roses. They bloom very well, and I was turned down saying, no, we're not interested. But we had the ability to do that, and we didn't do that. And that, I feel sad because that could have been a drawing card for the house. Oh, yeah, the fountain was a great achievement. And, thanks to an effort by Levon Beal Jones and Lorraine, your former board member, Lorraine Beal Anderson. And then Mrs. Stockton, Steve Stockton's wife, were on a committee with me to raise the money to replace or restore the fountain. I had gone, one of our docents, Lorraine Ford, who lived on Highland Avenue, grew up in Port Townsend, Washington, said they had the same fountain as we had here. It was in rough state. They restored theirs. So I went up to Port Townsend in like 1990. I went to 14 historic houses in 2 weeks on a driving tour. And one was up in Port Townsend. I saw the fountain, got pictures of it, came back, kind of brewed for a long time. Then we find out that Port Townsend restored their fountain. They still had the mold. So Julie's mother and stepfather lived up in northern Washington. We went up there. We went over by ferry to Port Townsend. We went to the foundry, talked to the guy there, and he said, yeah, it's possible. So the Lenny was raised. It was installed after I left Kimberly Crest. But I think the only difference was the little buoys on the fountain were anatomically correct on ours and not on the one up there. And this is a fountain I tracked down I actually saw them in Louisville, Kentucky, Proctor, Vermont. There was one at the Hotel Dell. There was one at the Flood Mansion in Northern California. There's one in Hudson, New York. There's one in another part of New York. But anyway, I laid the groundwork to getting that. And I guess the guy drove it down in his mini pickup from Port Townsend, Washington to here.
And then when we initially spoke to you about tonight, you mentioned that you would like to talk to us here in the room about a challenge. You did not elaborate on what the challenge was. Can you elaborate on that with us?
I understand, and I've talked to Anita West, who's the director at Kimberly Crest, and they're planning to restore the powder room back to its original things. And I shared with her what I knew, so I hope you can raise the money to do that. And then do the kitchen. If I can add a little, which is not related to that. I was doing some research a couple years ago. A friend of mine posted a thing about who the inventor of toilet paper was. And I looked at the posting on Facebook and I said, whoever Joseph Garrity is, that picture of the inventor of toilet paper is John Alfred Kimberly. It was his corporate photograph, which should be a picture in the collection. And so I called or emailed Tom Sutter and I said, he said, what do we do about it? So I got permission to go on Wikipedia, because if you called up Joseph Garrity, J.A.K.'s photo shows up. And I said, so I went on Wikipedia, I said, this isn't right. Don't ever use Wikipedia as your final source. And so that nothing happened. I changed that, and it's in Dow and stuff. You can even go on Amazon and buy a t-shirt of the photograph of Mr. Kimberly, and I brought one to show you. Or it's back there to look at.
I think might be next to you.
Oh, it's here. I'm sorry. I'll let you show it.
Okay.
But I think they've changed it just a little bit. Joseph Gay, he was born like 30 years before Mr. Kimberly. So the other night I typed in, just last week, I typed in the inventor of toilet paper in Google. Mr. Kimberly's picture comes up. What website is it on? A Continental website, which is Kimberly Clark. So here's Kimberly Clark showing the inventor of toilet paper, but has nothing to do with Kimberly Clark. And so I sent off a nasty comment.
You? A nasty comment?
Well, nasty for me. They changed it. I went on 20 minutes later and it was gone. And there is one item in the back, other than my three-cornered hat, which I wore for 5 summers, that I got real good, is a poppy. And that poppy represents Albert Walker Shirk. The people in Peru, Indiana, did all this research on World War I, figured out every World War I veteran from Miami County, Indiana, including Albert. And so outside their old courthouse, they took these poppies and stuck them on the ground. And on a very cold Veterans Day in 1918, I think, or 2018. Anyway, when Julie and I were back there, they gave us an extra one. So.
Well, I think we can all agree how fortunate we are as a city to have Kimberly Crest. And I think all in the room can agree tonight how fortunate we are to have a resource like Steve Spiller. So with that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I can come around and collect questions with the traveling mic. No.
No travel.
No travel.
No travel.
No, it is not traveling. Okay. Any questions?
That's some travel.
All right.
We got that much road.
On a leash. Okay. Questions?
No question.
I do have a question, but I also just have I want to extend my huge thanks to Steve. I'm Anita West from Kimberly Crest, and I have the privilege of being the current executive director, and truly feel like I'm standing on the shoulder of a giant. So you can only imagine, what a founding director must be responsible for when you start an enduring organization like a house museum and gardens like Kimberly Crest. So I can't tell you, multiple times a day, I think of Steve, and his fingerprints are on every corner of the place. And I think my docents that are all here in the room agree with me. So from the bottom of our hearts, Steve, thank you for all you've done. I have so many questions, and of course we have corresponded. So I have two questions. One is, what condition did you find the carriage house, which was also built in 1897 at Kimberly Crest? Was that a place of storage? I mean, certainly it was a garage at the time, but what condition did you find that in? And then I have a follow-up question.
Well,
That is an exceptional one.
when the association took over the house, they had to deal with things like do gutters work, do sprinklers work. One board member went up to the top of the roof with a hose and ran it through the gutters and downspouts to see if it worked. But before, right about the time I moved in, or at that time, they were dealing with termites, and the carriage house was fumigated, tented. Now, it certainly wasn't the tenting job that I'm familiar with at the Mission Inn, when that was tented. But they did tent it, and then they had to deal with subterranean termites in the house. Kimberly Crest has never been tented. There were, for whatever reason, the fumigation didn't kill the bees in the carriage house, or they came in after the fumigation, because the corner, if you're in the garage portion, the far corner, we had to actually remove the stucco, and because the bees were all in it. It was used for storage, and there was a lot of, I think, items that Mrs. Shirk had that were still stored in there. I don't know how much. There was a metal trough, stainless steel thing that I'm not sure. I thought I'd heard it was an embalming tank. But I don't know. But there was a bathtub still up in the carriage house, a wood, metal galvanized bathtub.
Did anyone live there, to your knowledge, ever?
I think so. Mrs. Hill had Chinese gardeners. There's a wonderful picture of a Chinese man by the carriage house. Yeah, the toilet's downstairs. And then there's the feed drop to bring the grain down. And I don't know if it's still there, but I insisted that the exhaust from Mrs. Shirk's Cadillac that was on the wall of the garage stay, because I wanted to show that. That's another regret. We had an opportunity to acquire, by donation, Mrs. Shirk's Cadillac. And people said, what would we do with it?
Was the carriage house ever part of the tours early on?
Yes, I mean, because we did exhibits in the garage side.
Yeah.
We mounted several exhibits in there. And then the gardener used the little, what's left of one little stall, where you can still see where the horses dug out the wood.
And then there was a follow-up?
No, maybe that I already asked my follow-up, but
Okay.
I do also want to say just a little story. When we did start planning for restoring the powder room,
Steve was nice enough to reach out and told me that he thought he had found the original wallpaper, or took a piece of it when that restoration project was underway. And so I was able to find it in our archives, so that as we do pick out things to bring it back to its original state, that we'll have something very similar. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Anita. Other questions?
Okay, are your cookies soft or are they crispy with soft inside?
They're crispy.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And for the benefit of the camera, the answer was crispy. So that's the definitive answer there. Mrs. Shirk's cookies were crispy. Other questions? Okay, I think one of our panelists has one.
I was fascinated when we were preparing for tonight. I was fascinated by a little story that you told us about Mrs. Shirk's travels in Egypt.
When I was attending an American Association for State and Local History annual meeting in Louisville, and that's when I found an example of the same fountain in Louisville, and it had been part of the World's Fair, actually, that was held there. And then I made arrangements. I rented a car, had to go to Lincoln's birthplace, but also went to Logansport, Indiana, where Mrs. Kimberly grew up, and I went to Peru, and then I went to Richmond. And in Peru, I was going through they used to have a museum in their court, the Miami County Courthouse. That's since moved into I guess an old department store. And I was going through Shirk family photo albums that had been donated. And I came across a series of photos that included Mrs. Shirk in 1924 visiting the Mediterranean on a cruise. Now, as a reminder, Mr. Shirk died in 1919. This is 5 years later. And she's on this cruise with her brother-in-law, her sister-in-law, and her mother-in-law. And they're going to all sorts of places. And I come across a picture of Mrs. Shirk and her sister-in-law, all dressed, full-length clothing, hats, bonnets, with a scarf under their chins. They are in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And how many years after
So
Carter?
within 12 months of the initial discovery, and at the time they had opened the sarcophagus for the very first time, revealing the gold of the funeral mask. So at the time they were there, almost certainly there would have been a stream of artifacts pouring from out of the tomb.
Now, when Julie and I were back there in 2022, we tried to see, I said, can you find those scrapbooks? They couldn't find them. They did find other pictures. I found a picture of Mrs. Shirk and Mr. Shirk playing bridge at the country club. But fast forward, we decided to do an exhibit in the carriage house on travel. And I don't know, I can't remember how it happened, but there was an attorney here in Redlands that lived on Olive named Dan Smith. He was related to the Moore family, Moore brothers. His wife, and I think the Moore brothers, or wives were sisters. Dan was on that same cruise. Mrs. Shirk wanted to play bridge, and she needed a fourth for bridge. Who came to say he would play bridge was Dan Smith. Now, Dan Smith did not know Mrs. Shirk. Mrs. Shirk didn't know Dan, because Dan had been away in college. Mrs. Shirk was relatively new to Redlands and didn't know everyone. So Dan played bridge with Mrs. Shirk. Dan had kept the original Thomas Cook travel guide for that trip, as well as a little miniature Sphinx that he purchased on that trip. The Miami County Historical Society, I made arrangements to have a print of that Valley of the Kings photograph. And we included that, the Thomas Cook guide, and the Sphinx souvenir in that exhibit.
And if I can just add some additional context, Tut Mania had already taken on, Lord Carnarvon had already died from the mosquito bite, you know, the curse of King Tut, but I mean, what a time to be there. And I think there's some other old Redlands stories about the Tut's curse. I think the Townsend family up on Crescent also had a story about a family member disappearing temporarily, and it had been attributed to Tut's curse. Anyway, so other questions? Well, hearing none, thank you everyone for being here tonight. I think there, oh, maybe one more, okay.
Did Grace Mullen have any affiliation with Mrs. Shirk?
I know that Mrs. Shirk obviously supported the Redlands Bowl. And I'm trying to think back, I don't remember. There might have been something with Mrs. Kimberly too in supporting Grace Mullen. And I guess, you know, Mrs. Shirk did have a chauffeur, Harold Simpson, or Howard Simpson, and he would drive the Cadillac, whatever version that happened to be, to the bowl. She does appear in at least one production at the bowl, Mrs. Shirk. So I'm sure Grace Mullen would have had something to do with that. And it was some Liberty play, or I'm not sure. Probably something to do with the scarf dance that the Kimberly Juniors do, I'm not sure. But there is some evidence that she actually had a role in one of the productions.
Well, and with that, a recording of tonight is going to be deposited into the oral history collection at the Heritage Room. So this record always remains with Redlands, and thank you for being here tonight to witness a little bit of history being documented.
And we'd like to say again, aside from all the work you've put into the Historical Society Board and the Heritage Awards over the years, but thank you so much for the legacy that you left us with, Kimberly Crest.